lived in the cottage next door. That is all gone now. You can't even hardly see where it is. But, and Maud was a wonderful cook, and people would come from all over on Sundays or holidays or something. The Welch House was a place
like
to
the
go.
city, so many strangers that moved in. But the old people, I think they were so much closer knit. There weren't that many cars in the valley. Everything that got together happened right in Petersburgh. Now everybody travels. They're in such a rush to try and make their We'll start with George. He was born up in Hoosick Falls. His father was a builder, and a good builder. His father made all kinds of money building homes.
Yes, his mother was a Reynolds, one of the Petersburgh Reynoldses. And he eventually was left one of the Reynolds farms, although he'd come to Petersburgh before that.
George set up one or two small factories in Hoosick Falls. I still have his engineering level that he set those up with. But George only had the high school education. But everything he did, wherever he went to work, he went to night school. And a year's course for anybody else would take George a month. And he'd have it. So I think it was Cutler Hammer or one of the big companies he worked for. They hired a bunch of young college men out of college. And George found out instantly that they were paying them more than they paid him. Well, he never really invented too much at that time, but he could perfect what other people had invented and couldn't make work. He perfected a camera and made it work. I don't know which company that was for, and these controls and whatnot that wouldn't work, George could perfect them. And he went to the big boss and said, hey, those guys are getting more money than me. I want a raise. I want to be at least as high, or I should be better. They haven't done anything for your company yet. The boss says, hey, you haven't got the education, you can't get the money. George says, okay, I'll finish the project I'm on now. It'll take me 2 weeks and I'm done. Have my money ready. You can't quit here. You can't make that much money anyplace. George says, I told him, just have my money ready. George started sending resumes. Now, the moving picture business was in New York City. It hadn't moved to California or Hollywood or anything yet. So it was around 1900 or a little before. The movies were in New York City. That's the stories I heard, you know. And he got a job. The cameraman was also the producer of the film. Made the films. He did everything. So George had a job. The 2 weeks were up. He went for his pay. The guy didn't have it ready. Well, George says, you'll have to mail it to me, or I'll be back. Simple as that. You can't quit. What do you mean? No way you can quit. We need you here. He says, you didn't need me 2 weeks ago, and I've taken another job. I told you I wanted more money, and you didn't give it to me. There's no staying. So he just hopped on the train, and away he went to New York City. He made, well, they were silent pictures, of course, but he made all kinds of silent movies. He went in the Adirondacks. Some millionaire had built a big estate and fixed it all up. I don't know around what lake or what. He went up and took scenic movies of that. And you had to add music with it, and he'd write what they had, maybe somebody playing a piano, and then he'd write some of that down and let somebody else that was a writer finish it, but he'd have it all down what they should be saying as the film went on. And he not only took these pictures, but he also cut and edited them and made them the way they should look as they showed them. Now, he worked his way back and forth across the country here and there, and he ended up in the Everglades swamps in Florida. The first movie that ever came out of the Everglades, George made. He found a man that had quite a rich wife that lived in the hotels and whatnot when it was wintertime down there. But then in the summertime, this fellow also had an Indian wife, and he went back in the glades, and I guess they caught alligators. I don't think they had to poach them back then. And then when it started to get cool back in the swamps, he'd come out and live with his wife. And he'd put on alligator shows. He'd wrestle alligators in tubs and whatnot. And then he went back to Florida with a whole troop. They sent him down, and the country went down money-wise. He got all his actors, actresses, and everything to work in Florida. Went down from New York City to where it was warm in the wintertime. And the outfit he hired out for it went broke. And he had all these people down there. None of them had any money. George went to 2 or 3 different cities down there and said, I'd like to make a promotion film for your city. What would that be, Chamber of Commerce or something, to get your people down here from up north? What would you pay? Well, George, as I told him, I'll try to have everybody in your city in this picture that comes out. And we'll pick the biggest attraction you got in the city, and I got actors and actresses that will make it really look like it's bigger than you people that do it every day do. He says, I'll set them up, and he charged enough money for making that, whatever you call the film, promotion film, to get all of them back to New York City to their homes. And he only had so damn much film, he couldn't waste one frame on that film. He says, I'd crank that, they were all hand cranked, crank that just as slow as I could crank it and still have the pictures coming out. And from a bandstand or something, he made one complete circle and got all the people that turned out in the center of town with a band playing, and his actors and actresses making believe they're having so much fun playing tennis or whatever they did in those days. And he says, I developed it. And he says, got the whole Chamber of Commerce, everybody in. And he says, oh my God, they were happy with that film. Unbelievable happy, you know.
Yeah.
So he says they got everybody back home. 1918, somewhere in there. I think he went to work for the United States Army, doing pictures. They had some new battleship or something out. They cleared him, gave him clearance, and he rode on that and took pictures of the way it sailed and everything for their training books. And then I think he got down in as far as Guatemala or someplace, and he took a movie or 2 down there. Then he came back to New York, and the movie industry was moving to Hollywood, California, wherever in California. And he did movies out there for quite a while. In fact, that chair right there was one of the sets in one of his movies. In fact, he sent one piece home from every big movie he did, and that chair is one of them. Another chair that they broke in and stole on me was in that house. They stole 2 chairs, but one was a carved lion's head in hardwood. I didn't even know what kind of hardwood it was the back of the chair. He liked it down here better than Hoosick Falls, so he was down on this farm when he was young. His aunts owned this farm. Mary Reynolds, Jessie Reynolds, and Mary, Jessie, and the one they called Lizzie. That must have been Elizabeth.
He had this, was eventually left this large house. You probably are familiar with it. It's been greatly renovated. It's at the bottom of the Stillman Village Road. It's been renovated on Route 22, right on Route 22, and he was left that. I know he stayed there with those girls. There were 2 unmarried sisters and their unmarried brother, who was a character all his own. He was really a character. This an uncle of George's.
Oh, the one sister. That farm from Stiles Reynolds raised 13 or 14 kids. And his sister, a Reynolds girl, married Haynes and moved to Hoosick Falls with him. He was George's father, the builder. So that's what made these girls over here his aunts. Well, he liked it down here. Anytime he had time off from school or anything, he was on a train and down here with the aunts and one uncle, and he enjoyed the outdoors and the fishing. And that big house was built for only one reason, to take tourists in the summertime.
That's his house.
They came up from New York City. They could ride the train up. You know, it was hot in the city, no air conditioning or anything. The richer people would send their wives and children up, and they'd come up on the train weekends and go back to New York City.
They could ride all the way to Petersburgh.
Well, you had to change, I think, in Chatham or someplace. You come up to Chatham, and then you got on this Vermont Railroad and came up to here. And it stopped at the railroad station. There were any special people or anything come. They had influence enough so they could get the train to stop right in front of the door. In fact, when one of those girls got married, one of George's aunts, they stopped the train and they bought a red carpet. We had it. It was pretty well mouse-eaten in what time. But George told me what it was rolled up. They rolled that from the front door after the wedding down to the train, and they got on the train.
That's good.
Well, the husband she married thought she was rich, and she thought he was rich. They got to Chicago by train, and George said they both found out the other one wasn't rich, telling each other, we didn't bring our money, we'll have to spend yours, I'll pay you when we get back home. And his aunt, which I think was Jessie, said, to hell with you. And she went and turned her tickets in wherever they were going and came right back to Petersburgh. So they had one day together and they divorced. I've heard George tell that. That tickled him. God, I think he moved into Petersburgh when I was like 3 or 4 years old, 5 years old. But why George retired? He went to a doctor. He went back down to Guatemala or some one of those South or Central American countries. I don't know which ones. I got the pictures from all of them. And when I see the pictures, I can spit the name out. But to name all the different countries he was in and what he took pictures of there, I can't do. Quite a few years ago, George told me my memory's not as good as it used to be, all these stories. But he wouldn't live down with the aunts, but he came and he kind of took care of them. He lived in the same house across from the Methodist church, 2-story house. I think he lived upstairs and my mother and father lived downstairs. And he and my father, they'd get out and do anything together. If my father's car broke down or anything, George would be out helping him, or he'd help George on his old cars. And at election time, my mother used to raise hell and try to throw both of them out. They'd hammer on that kitchen table. My father was a Republican and George was a Democrat. And they'd get hollering and yelling. My father'd stay up all night and then go to work the next morning. They'd argue over who'd make the best president, why, all that sort of thing. But George liked me and my sister. My sister'd go up and visit for hours. He'd show her things, and he'd take me in the car. He'd bring me down here. But anyway, he went back out to California. Well, one girl actress, at the time she was probably a Shirley Temple, her name was Madge Evans. I have letters to George from this Madge Evans. You could look her up in the silent movies because she started as a child and went right up until they got movies talking. And then she didn't have the voice, but she had the looks and the poise and all that sort of thing. And made beautiful pictures. And George had taken her childhood movies and whatnot, and he stayed with her off and on for quite a few years. I have letters to George from her. Then he stopped working for movie companies. General Foods had got started pretty well, and Del Monte. Now that's what George had the most stock in, what he lived on. But he made these promotion films, worked for Del Monte and them. And George was a cook that nobody would believe. He always came to our house, always Christmas, New Year's, Easter Sunday. And he'd make 2 or 3 dishes like the desserts. And someday I'll show you the pictures of them. He had pictures of all the girls on the line, women, you know, getting the fruit ready for the canning and everything, all the operations. He made movies of those, you know, advertising films in that day and age. And then he'd make like upside down cake with the half peaches and every piece of fruit cut perfect. George would lay these out. And George says I might work all night baking and getting Hooray set up, you know, to film. After he filmed all these women, they had the bonnets on so no hair could fall in the food, and he'd pick out the prettiest ones on the whole damn line and doll them and paint them up a little bit and put them where the camera was going to see them the best. And then at the end, these beautiful, what you could build out of their fruits and whatnot, out of the cans or otherwise. And so he made quite a lot of money at that.
Maud Welch ran the hotel here. She and her husband ran the Welch house. And George Haynes lived in the cottage next door. That is all gone now. You can't even hardly see where it is. But, and Maud was a wonderful cook. And people would come from all over. On Sundays or holidays or something, the Welch house was a place to go. And people would ask her for her recipes, and she would always very willingly give them, but she left out something. She never would give them her recipe the way she made it. She'd give them a recipe that would make an edible product, but it wouldn't come out like hers. Well, George Haynes was living in Petersburgh at that time, and he rented the cottage. There was the hotel, and then next to it was a little cottage, which the hotel people owned, the Welches owned, and they would rent it. And George Haynes lived there. And Maud sent him or took over to him when he moved in, some muffins, I think it was, that she had made. And George thought they were just wonderful and asked for the recipe. So she gave him one of her made-over recipes. And then she'd laugh and she'd say, George Haynes can't get those muffins to come out the way mine do. He tries and tries. And George fancied himself quite a cook. Well, he had lived alone a lot, and he fancied himself quite a cook, but he never could come up to Maud's. But nobody else could that she gave a recipe to either.
He was quite an inventor, and his early entry, worked with George Eastman at Eastman Kodak, and he also was in part owner or heavily involved from these letters, which I found, in a motion picture company in New Jersey. And I believe he had patents, quite a number of patents on photographic things. I think mainly motion picture patents, which are probably outmoded, although I think he probably collected a little from those patents all his life.
Oh, they couldn't find a shop to satisfy them in New York City. They went across New Jersey. They got a machine shop. There was an old German fella he got that was one hell of a machinist. He was a partner. There was a Jewish fella that was a hell of a businessman. And between the three of them, I don't remember how George got them together. I think he put ads in the paper. He needed one with money and one with a machinist. And he did the drawings. He was a super good, that's what he did at Cutler Hammer, mechanical drawing, but he was almost an engineer. They built a camera, a moving picture camera at that time that was unsurpassed by anything on the market because he'd used all the ones that were out. Now at one time I had all the drawings. I don't think I have too many of them left. The name of it was Prisma, I think. And they got this all patented. And I think it was Eastman Kodak, or one of the big ones at that day and age, offered him $150,000. Now in those days that was way better than $1 million, $1.5 million today. That was money. The three of them could be set for life. Well, George says, we'll sell it, I can build a better one. We can build a better one. And the Jewish fella says, that's our first offer. You're crazy. And George says, no, somebody else might come out with something. And the German fellow was undecided. He wouldn't vote with either one of them. George was trying to get him to vote with him, but he was older and he wanted the money. But if there was more money, he wanted more money. And it was between George and the Jewish fella. And they dickered and fought back and forth for like 3 or 4 months. Eastman Kodak bought somebody else's camera that was nearly as good as theirs. They had a camera, they couldn't get peanuts for it. I think George took the one prototype working model and went back and did some more promotion films in some South or Central America. Where's Castro? Over in Cuba. Maybe he went over to Cuba and did some promotional. And he went to Canada a few times and took films. And I think it was after that, it's someplace South America, that he contacted malaria. And he went to a doctor, and he thought he was going to die there. And the doctor says, I can probably get you better. But he says, wherever you want to die, anybody that gets this and the dysentery and malaria together, this bad, they don't live very long for some reason. But he says, if you get better enough to travel, where you want to be buried is where you should head for. So George says, about a month, I don't know, I guess they had quinine or something. He says, I started to get better and straightened out, and he says, I got headed for home just as fast as I could go. And that's when he ended up back in Petersburgh. That was sometime in the 30s. And he rented 2 or 3 different places in the village after that, and he never went to another doctor on his own in his life. He said they're all a bunch of quacks, but he bought the medical magazines, and he wouldn't eat bread after it was fresh baked. Had to be dried out for a while and always toasted is the only way he'd eat bread. And very careful of what he ate and everything.
Yeah.
And he'd get a little touch of the malaria once in a while, but he could take care of that.
Fair.
Yeah, at 86, and I think if he'd let me get him a doctor, he'd be living yet today. Yeah, he had one doctor. My father and I came down to check on him one time, and he was in bed, and Christ, we went in, and he was really down. I think he had pneumonia or something. And my dad says, George, you got to have a doctor. I'm not having any goddamn quack. He says, all they do is tell you they're going to die, and then they try to kill you. I'm not having one. So my father went back up to my mother, and my mother was kind of a practical nurse around town. She go to everybody. When they got right down sick, they didn't want the hospitals to roll back then, and she'd take care of them until they died, a lot of the elderly people. And my father says, Clara, I don't know what we're going to do with old George, but he is damn sick. And I said, yeah, I can't hardly talk, huh? Well, she says, I'll go down and see. Well, she went and rounded up what she had in the house. My mother was quite a save-the-baby person, the little, you must have heard of it. I think it was built in Albany or Troy or someplace. It's grease and an oil, and they called it Save the Baby. And every mother in this valley used it, and doctors would say, you put it on your throat with a hot rag around it, and you breathe it up your nose, and you take a teaspoonful of it. Well, she says, George, you've got to get undressed so I can put this Save the Baby. It's got to be on your chest and your neck and your back and whatnot. I ain't going to use any of that damn stuff. My mother heated it up on the damn wood stove and just poured it right on him. He cursed like a trooper. And she went right over to the phone and she called up a doctor and got, I forgot, one of the local doctors. We always used to have a doctor either here or Berlin years ago. We haven't had him in late years. And he came up. George wouldn't let him give him any shots, but I think he took a few pills and whatnot the doctor gave him, and he got over that and went quite a few years more. As my mind works back to it and whatnot, or if I were going through the pictures, I mean, that's just touched the slightest corner of what this man did in his lifetime. There are very few people that ever cover the vast amount of things. But perfection. He set up 2 or 3 of the, was Noble and Wood or which one? He set the machines up in that factory in Hoosick Falls when he was just a kid. Nobody could believe how perfect he got them. But a man that anything his hand turned to, he could do.
He became eccentric, sort of a minor Howard Hughes type in his old age.
Tell me about that.
But George lived there all by himself in this fully furnished, all Victorian furniture. Nothing had ever been touched. For the 2 old ladies and their brother, all unmarried, lived there. But he took no interest in it except as a place to live. And he lived in the kitchen, and the rest of the house just sat there and sort of fell down around his ears until the day he died. And we used to go, always to call on George. We never were asked in the house. We always stood around, sometimes maybe sat down on the porch steps. Always before, and we were always prepared for this, when we got ready to go, he'd say, you got a cigarette? Well, he could have afforded to buy all the cigarettes he wanted, but he really liked to mooch them. And I don't know whether we smoked them very much otherwise, but we always were prepared, and we always gave him a few cigarettes. And he kept geese, and that was in a couple of cases, that was a disaster.
But George made friends with very few damn people. Very few. He didn't want friends.
So George kept geese, and to himself in his old age. His mother was a fascinating person, and so was his grandmother. Mame, his mother, I have to tell you this on the side. I could tell you now who was born in Petersburgh among the women and who wasn't by whether they were known by their first names. And you see, the generations, we didn't think of generation gap, but things just rolled on. The same families were there. So that we knew all these people so well that I called his mother Mame, although she was my grandmother's age. And my mother called her Mame. Everybody called her Mame. And Mame had a parrot. And the parrot, she had a parrot most of her life. And the parrot of course, was fascinating to me. So I would stop at Mame's whenever I had a chance on my way home. And the parrot would say, "Poor Elmer, poor Elmer," and that was Fuller's father. "Poor Elmer." And the other thing the parrot would say was, "Grobacker, Grobacker, Grobacker." Well, that was the name of their landlord. George Grobacker owned a number of houses along the head of the lane, and he was their landlord. So I suppose that probably George Grobacker had said something at some time that had caused the parrot to notice it, and what the parrot's mother and father said about him.
Oh, Hewitt?
Her name was Mary Reynolds Hewitt, and her mother was famous midwife. She rarely left her house, but she always knew all the news. You could stop at Maine's and find out what was going on almost any time. Elmer Hewitt, 1861 to 1941, and Mary Reynolds, his wife, 1866 to 1956. So she lived to be 90.
His mother was one of the most delightful people, and she never got out, but she always stayed home. She had a parrot that she visited with and fed coffee. She'd always ask the parrot if he wanted a cup of coffee, and she'd get a cup of coffee for the parrot. And she had two sons, Fuller and Fred. Fred Hewitt was the photographer who took a lot of these pictures of Petersburgh.
Now, Mame Hewitt, I lived right next door to her. And she didn't leave the house. I don't think she was on the ground for the last 40 years of her life. But when my mother would say goodbye, told me I was headed for the school, Mame Hewitt would come out and say, "Goodbye, Charles." And the two porches were only like 30 or 40 feet apart. And Mame and my mother would talk back and forth. But they'd both say goodbye to me when I went to school. You know, I went to grade school down in the village, a little two-room school. And Mame had a parrot. I remember the parrot as good as Mame. I very seldom went up to their house unless my mother sent a piece of cake or something over to Fred and her. Or, you know, something. Or if they were sick, she'd send over soup or something like that. But Mame, for the last 15 years of her life, I think all she ate was tea and crackers. She wasn't much bigger around than my little finger. I can remember that. The smallest woman I'd ever seen in all my life, you know. But maybe that's why she lived so long.
So
She was still alive when we got married, was she?
Oh.
Just a nice old lady, and I mean, she was so frail and thin, she didn't come out of the house.
Yeah.
But I just remember, you know, and her husband died years and years when I was a little bitty kid.
Do you know?
She was just about 100 years old, I think. Ask CB if he remembered. She was in her 90s. So Mame Hewitt, that's a hard one. Because a very quiet lady. I mean, she never got in trouble or never said a bad word or anything like that, but her parrot could curse. Now, Mame Hewitt must have come up out of New York. No, I guess she didn't. I don't know what Mame's name was before she got married. Can you believe that? That's very odd for me. I most generally knew their maiden names, but Mame's I didn't. But her parrot came out of New York City. Like a sailor and a captain and two or three guys were walking up the street, and the parrot was on the shoulder of one of these sailors. And, you know, they had quite a few story buildings. And a lady was hanging her wash out, a friend of Mame's, I think. And the parrot squawked and hollered 3 or 4 times and took off and flew right up and in her window where she was hanging her clothes out. And she yelled down to the sailor, the captain of the ship, whoever was carrying it, "Will your bird bite me or claw me or anything? I'll bring him down to you. If he's going to, you know, hurt me, I'm not going to touch him. You'll have to come up." Keep this. But anyway, he flew away from me. Let him stay there. Shoot him, beat him to death with a broom, whatever you want to. And they just kept on walking. Well, she kept the parrot in New York City. And the first time she came up to see Mame, whether it was a relative or what, I don't know. She brought the parrot up and Mame kept it. And that parrot lived as long as Mame. That had to be an old, old parrot. But they didn't know how old it was when she got it, but
Mame Hewitt. I would take when the boys were little, I'd take them up so she could see them and make a fuss over them. And I remember she had a little teeny tiny ring. I don't know if I told you about that she had lost a baby. And that ring had been that baby's ring. And she would show that to me in her treasures, that littlest ring I ever saw. And that was kind of pathetic. She had lost a baby. She and her husband were very popular people, active in all organizations, and he directed the band, and the Petersburgh band played all over for picnics and social events, family reunions and things like that. And they went to Williams College and played for fraternity parties. They would be invited over there and they'd come back and they'd tell what good refreshments they had and how many drinks they had and whatnot. They'd have a good time going to the Williams College things. I knew her very well and I was very fond of her. And as I say, she married Earl Wilcox when she was a young woman and lost 3 babies right off the bat, but eventually had a son. And she worked hard. She worked hard to educate that son. Her husband worked in Troy. He had a political job for the county. But Edith worked for me. She worked for me for quite a while doing cleaning and laundry and things to get money to put her son through RPI. And she used to say that she didn't really like too much to work for me because I wanted things always just the same. And she never felt that she'd cleaned a room, that she changed the furniture around, did things different. She'd think I was an awful stick in the mud because I liked things put back where they belonged and I could find them the next time. And as I say, she always played the piano and for the Eastern Star. And they used to play for dime socials. We used to have dime socials. And she used to play there, and they'd dance. Yeah. And they were at the Masonic Temple. They were usually on a Friday night. And sometimes they'd play cards, and sometimes they'd dance. Refreshments would be served, and people of all ages would go. It wasn't just for young people, it was for everybody would go and have a good time together. And Edith would usually play the piano and provide the music. Maybe Earl would be there and play the violin. She was a lot of fun to be with. Always, you go down to Edith's and you'd always have a cup of coffee and a cigarette and a bun or something. We'd always sit and visit and talk and laugh.
Her father and mother ran, I'm not sure whether they owned, but they ran at least the big old Worthington Inn that burned when she was young, a few years before this picture would have been taken, I would guess. My mother knew her as a child because Mama worked across the street and at the Success. She was secretary to the Success Company. My mother was secretary to the Success Company's head. And Edith lived across the street, so Mama saw a lot of her as a child. And she was just a nice little girl. She was musical. She could sing. She played the piano. Well, she could play church hymns. Well, and she could, that is, on the pump organ. I remember doing that, and she could play, what would now be called a combo. And her husband was kind of thought of as the town musician. And she would play the piano for this combo when she was needed. Well, let's see. She was married when she was in her early 20s. I don't know exactly what date. And she had one child. She was quite modern, as Petersburgh women went. Her friends, she played bridge in the 20s. I suppose they played, I'm pretty sure they played auction, not contract bridge. And she smoked cigarettes, which my mother's generation thought was pretty wild. Not quite right. And I suspect that occasionally she and her group might have had just a little bit of illicit booze. But she was not by any means, I don't mean that she was an alcoholic or anything of that sort, but that was, they were quite advanced in their behavior. But when the Methodists, and she was a Methodist, weren't quite sure, I think she became a Methodist maybe because her husband was a Methodist, because her grandmother played the organ in the church. Baptist church. The Methodists, at least, and the Baptists maybe even more so. Dancing was a little bit not, well, in public, was a little bit not well thought of. And of course, to play cards or to dance or to sew on Sunday was unthinkable. But as I say, her group were somewhat more advanced in their thinking than many of the rest.
And her husband, Earl, was a band leader. He directed the band here in Petersburgh. Petersburgh used to have a beautiful band.
Yeah, we did.
There was quite a number of people in that. I always remember she used to make the oyster stew. We'd have a donation to Methodist Church, and she and Hazel Waters, I think, used to make their oyster stew. And of course, she had just the one son, Stevie, but he passed away. Well, she was always laughing. Edith was always a happy-go-lucky.
Now, she was town clerk, just as nice, likable person as you could ever meet. Now, she had the one son, Stephen. He was right around my age, and he died years ago. I think he was pretty sharp. He graduated from RPI, but I guess the bottle kind of too much of it. She was in the Eastern Star with my mother, and as they went through the different chairs or whatever it was. But there's another, just a super nice person, minded her own business, brought up Stephen. We were in the Boy Scouts together, and I can't remember which dinners, but the churches always used to put on oyster dinner, turkey dinners, all the different dinners. Everybody in town showed up for them. I mean, she was always there to help whichever church it was. But everybody went to both churches' dinners. That was a night out. They didn't get many here in the country. I mean, people would fight. They'd be over it the next day. If anybody had a fire, everybody was there. Grab them and the kids, take them home with them, whoever was there. It's not like that today. We've gotten more like the city. So many strangers have moved in. But the old people, I think they were so much closer knit. There weren't that many cars in the valley. Everything they got together happened right in Petersburgh. Now everybody travels. They're in such a rush to try and make their living. They work so hard at it. They don't even know their neighbors exist. And they'll fight with their neighbor at the drop of a hat. And I mean, it never used to be that way. You could be constable. In fact, Harry Brown, my father's opponent in the election, I delivered feed for him when I was very young. Likeable guy, did favors for everybody in town, and he was a Democrat too. And
Edith, after she got through high school, she taught for a couple of years up in East Hollow. And then she got married. She had been a teacher, but it was for just a short time. They had small little schools all over, you know. Oh, they didn't have all the licensing and things that they have now. If you graduated from high school, you could get a temporary license and teach for a while. Yeah. Which she did. Then she and Earl were married. I know that she was a lot of fun, and she had a lot of friends. And the people who had the shirt factory was operated by a man by the name of Joe Steiner. And, well, they were a little different from ordinary Petersburg people, you know. But Edith was very friendly with them, and she would go to New York with them and visit at their homes, and they would come after they left here, after the factory burned, and they left here. Then they would come and visit with her, and they were very close friends. Edith helped me a great deal. After my mother died, I needed help here. And I was talking with her one day, and I needed help, and she wanted to earn some money. She said that she wanted to send her son to RPI, and they needed funds to do it, and could she come and help me? Well, I was delighted. I never would have thought of asking her, but being as she offered, I was quick to jump at it. And then when my children were born, she was of inestimable value. And my children, my two boys, they just adored her. And she could make things awfully interesting and fun for them. The presents she gave them, I remember when she gave them a tent, and they had a ball in that tent all summer. And once I went away for a weekend, and when I came home, they were sitting on the living room floor, Edith and the two boys, and they were making castles with those little records, little plastic records that children had in paper cups. And they were building these things. Here they had countless toys, but they were much more interested in the plastic records and the paper cups. But I do think that you had quite an insight when you said that she was kind of overshadowed by her husband, that the people knew her husband and they didn't know her. Actually, I think she deserved a lot of credit that maybe she didn't get, because she was always very helpful to him in everything that he did. As I think back, I think in my own family, for instance, my father was in public life, and my mother worked very quietly behind the. I know that Edith, I do know one thing, that Earl went into politics, and he ran, well, I guess he ran for supervisor of Petersburgh, and there was a big tea in Troy, and Edith was asked to pour. And she didn't want to do it, and she didn't do it. And I tried to get her to, and I said, well, why don't you go? And she said, oh, no. She said, my hands would be too blank. She said, I don't have the diamonds the other women do. Isn't that pitiful?
The Weavers, in the first place, they were very strong-minded. They tended to have rather high tempers and were excitable. Now, the Weavers were great hunters. They kept on with the old traditions, and hunting was one of the things they did, and they were always fascinated, the men, with guns and hunting and things of that sort. Julia and Beth both lived in the East Hollow. They would kind of be on speaking terms with each other once in a while. They would, if anybody else had said anything mean about them, the sister, they would have come to the defense. But among themselves, they occasionally had little disagreements, and they were on the same telephone line. All of East Hollow had the same telephone line, and Julia was on, and occasionally, listening in was, well, everybody did it, but nobody was supposed to do it. And once in a while, one of them would hear the other one saying something about her and would break right into the conversation. Although they were both quick-tempered, and I'm sure neither one of them ever did an illegal, immoral, or what's the other thing that goes with those two things that are fun? They were strictly just usual people. But Julia was the youngest and had 3 brothers, so I suspect that would be perhaps the reason for the curls in the first place. Her mother would have had time to do it because the other children were older. And the fact that she had the 3 brothers is probably why she was posing with the deer head. Now, it's vaguely possible that she shot the deer herself, but I'm inclined to doubt it.
Yeah, well, I can tell you a story about her. Maybe I ought not to tell it. As I told you, I used to be town clerk. One day, I wasn't home. My mother was here. She was my assistant. When anybody came for a hunting license or a fishing license or anything, if I wasn't here, she wrote them. And this day, and my nephew, Henry, Hilda's husband, worked up at the post office. And Julia Church came in and wanted a hunting license. And she spun this long tale to my mother about how she'd always wanted to go hunting, and now she was going to go hunting, and she had come to get this license. And as she went out of the house and up the street, she met Henry coming down toward the house. Henry Allen, Hilda's husband, who at that point was just a young boy around here. He wasn't married or anything. And he congratulated Julia on this big deer she just killed. And he came in and told my mother, and Mama said, well, that's impossible. I've just given her the license. But of course, her husband had gotten the deer and didn't want to put his tag on it, so he couldn't, because then he couldn't hunt anymore. So he'd had her come and get a tag. But it was known immediately. But it was very shocking to my mother. Well, I always liked her very much. She was kind of, as a girl, at this age, I think she was quite an athletic person. Belonged to the Girl Scouts, and going hunting, I guess, wouldn't have been really unusual for her. But, and later on, she married Milton Church.
Because I say she lived up in East Hollow. The East Hollow and Hill Hollow roads used to start right together there. And, you know, one went up your way, and the other one divided right there by Earl Hewitt, you know. But since then, they've made the Route 2.
Oh, we used to travel together, she and her husband and my husband and myself, and we'd go on trips. And when we was up on the farm, I used to live up in East Hollow. Oh, she used to come up there, and we used to go after flowers, and I know we went after arbutus one time, trailing arbutus. I guess you haven't got a right to pick it now. Picnics together, we used to get together. Very pretty, and she hair all curled up.
She always dressed. I've heard you tell how she always dressed.
Dressed nice, yeah. She always dressed nice. She had quite a few boyfriends, and my husband, or the one who was with him, he was smoking, and the top of the car caught on fire, and burnt the top of my brother's car right off. Julia and my brother.
Didn't she belong to the Campfire Girls?
Campfire Girls, yes, she belonged to the Campfire Girls. I don't know what more. We used to go up to Hakes's and play croquet. Well, we used to have good times. We used to go on trips, you know, I mean, like a weekend and all, go to New Hampshire with Julia Milton. Where we always went.
Yeah. Jefferson Mountain.
Jefferson Mountain. That's where they always wanted to go. That's got this place we liked quite well, and so we went there. They had a restaurant right below where the cabins were, so.
To smell that pine.
Oh yes, she used to like smell that pine. She'd be so glad when we get up there, so she could smell that pine. Yes, I forgot that.
And then she was always talking about Father John's medicine, and I can remember that just about her talking about.
I forgot my.
It was some kind of a medicine. I don't know what it was for.
No,
she swore up and down with that Father John's.
Too. I never remember Julia wearing that. Looks like bloused, isn't it? Or is that a skirt? But it don't look even around there to be. So it was sewed. If you look at it, notice.
I didn't notice.
Maybe it's a homemade.
Maybe it's something. Yeah, well,
yes, because her sister was a great seamstress. She used to sew for me even. Yes. And then Aunt Julia. Oh my Lord! How she used to. She had these birds that would come to her house at the window, and she was a great one for feeding chipmunks and squirrels and all this. She loved animals, and she was a pretty good marksman. So she used to shoot the purple finch because they would get all the food. Oh, she used to get so disgusted with those purple finch and scare all the smaller ones away. But she had quite a few sisters and brothers, but they're all gone, of course. Yeah. She, even in her older years, she used to take a walk and go way up by Klein's, you know, where Klein's are, I'm sure, Mabel Klein, and, you know, she used to walk up there just about every day. and she worked in a dress factory. Yeah, and then the one in Hoosick Falls, am I right, Mother? Yes, in later years she worked at the one in Hoosick Falls.
I know we used to get some front waist
Shirtwaist?
because I know I would take them home with me nights so I could, we call it pinching, turn the rough edge in, and then you'd be all ready to put it on your machine. I used to do that. She looked so neat and nice, always was dressed nice, and her hair, she always kept that so it looked nice. And of course Bessie, that's her sister, used to help her put it in, not ringlets, but curls.
The way her hair is in the picture, is that,
Well,
that's not the way she wore it?
no, not so. Her hair wasn't so long as that. No, she.
But it was when she was in the campfire, 'cause
Yeah,
I remember
yeah.
that on the wagon, all of you girls
Yes,
were on
I've
the
got.
wagon.
Yeah, yeah.
They're on the wagon, listen.
Yeah, but see, these curls are way down on her. Yeah, she was good company. We used to have a lot of fun on our trips.
Julia Church, Julia Weaver, yeah. She was an uncle's sister. Just as nice a person as you'll ever meet. She was Julia Weaver. She had Archie. Art Weaver was our fire chief. That was her brother. Julia didn't do... she was a beautiful housewife, a wonderful woman. Everybody that knew her liked her, but she wasn't one of those real going people. She brought up her family and just a very nice home person.
Minded her own business.
They went to church every week, behaved themselves, didn't get in trouble like the younger kids today, you know.
Who was that old?
I don't even think she'd sip a glass of beer behind the curtain or anything, you know, that nice a person.